The sirens blared down our quiet suburban street, their flashing red and blue lights cutting through the peaceful afternoon like an emergency scene out of an action movie. My heart lurched for a second. Was someone hurt? A burglary? But then I saw her. Karen. Standing on her perfectly trimmed lawn, arms crossed, her phone still clutched in her hand like a weapon of mass destruction. And that's when it hit me, this was about my kids. I had barely stepped onto my porch when two police officers, looking both confused and irritated, marched up my driveway. Behind them, Karen stood with the smug satisfaction of a villain who thought they had finally won. My 10-year-old son Liam and 8-year-old daughter Zoe were frozen in place, their game of tag interrupted mid-chase. Zoe still had one foot in the air like she wasn't sure if she was supposed to finish her next step or surrender. One officer, a stocky man with tired eyes, cleared his throat. "Sir, we got a call about a disturbance involving your children." I stared at him for a long second, then turned to Karen, who was already launching into her well-rehearsed monologue. "Yes, officer. These children have been running wild all day, screaming at the top of their lungs, damaging public peace. I asked their father to control them but he refused. We have noise regulations in this neighborhood, and this is unacceptable." Liam looked at me bewildered. "Dad, we were just playing tag." The other officer, a woman in her 40s who looked like she had seen it all, sighed and pinched the bridge of her nose. "Ma'am, you called us for children playing outside?" Karen gasped like someone had just accused her of stealing from charity. "Yes. They were screaming. It's a residential neighborhood. We can't have that kind of chaos here. This is a civilized place, not some carnival." I had to fight the urge to laugh. A carnival? Because my kids were playing tag? I glanced at the officers, waiting for them to say this was a joke, but judging by the way they were both looking at Karen, I realized they were as exhausted as I was. "Ma'am," the male officer said slowly, rubbing his temple, "there is nothing illegal about children playing outside. If they were causing actual damage or disturbing the peace in a significant way, that would be different. But they're just being kids." Karen's eyes bulged. "So you're telling me I have to listen to this racket every single day? What about my rights?" The female officer exhaled sharply, clearly losing patience. "With all due respect, ma'am, calling 911 over children playing is an inappropriate use of emergency services. If this happens again, you could be facing a fine for misuse of police resources." Karen's mouth snapped shut so hard I thought she might have cracked a tooth. She turned to me with a look that promised vengeance. "You'll regret this," she hissed before storming back inside her house. The officers, now completely over this entire situation, gave me a nod before heading back to their patrol car. Liam and Zoe stood still, wide-eyed. Zoe whispered, "Are we criminals?" I laughed, shaking my head. "Not yet. But Karen is sure trying to make it happen." The kids went back to playing, but I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to take an L gracefully. No, she would find another way to make our lives miserable. And I had a feeling this was only the beginning. The next morning I found my first surprise. A notice from the HOA taped to my front door, stating that I was in violation of neighborhood regulations due to excessive noise disturbances. Attached to it was a formal complaint, filed by none other than Karen. She was already making her next move. I crumpled the letter in my hand, shaking my head. Oh, so this was how she wanted to play. Fine. If Karen was declaring war, I was ready for battle. But she had no idea who she was dealing with. She thought calling the cops on my kids was extreme? That was just the warm-up act. Because what came next was going to make her regret every single second she had ever wasted trying to police my family. The next morning I woke up to another envelope taped to my front door. At this point I wasn't even surprised. With a sigh, I tore it open, expecting another ridiculous complaint. Sure enough, it was from the HOA, citing excessive noise disturbances, with a formal warning. I didn't even need to check the complainant's name. This had Karen written all over it. I chuckled to myself, shaking my head. Karen was playing dirty, using the HOA as her personal attack dog. She must have thought I would back down, apologize, or maybe even force my kids to stay inside like prisoners. But if she thought I was the kind of guy who let ridiculous people walk all over him, she was in for a rude awakening. Later that afternoon I saw Karen standing outside, arms crossed, watching me like a hawk as I mowed my lawn. Her expression was a mix of smugness and anticipation, as if she was expecting me to storm over and beg for forgiveness. Instead, I cranked up the mower to its loudest setting and waved at her with a bright, cheerful smile. She scowled and disappeared inside her house. By the next day, Karen had escalated her war. A second HOA notice arrived, this time claiming my mailbox was in violation of neighborhood aesthetic standards. I stared at the letter, then at my completely normal black mailbox which had been there for years without issue. Either Karen had bribed someone at the HOA or she was filing so many complaints they were just rubber stamping them to get her off their backs. If Karen wanted to play games, I was happy to play along. But I wasn't going to fight this war with anger. I was going to fight it with something far more powerful. Petty compliance. The next weekend, I repainted my mailbox a stunning shade of neon pink. Now technically there were no rules against neon-colored mailboxes in the HOA guidelines. I had checked. Twice. And just to be sure, I added a cheerful rainbow flag on the side because if Karen was mad before, I wanted to see just how much steam she could build up. By Monday morning she was at my door. She didn't knock. She didn't ring the doorbell. She stood there, fuming, waiting for me to acknowledge her. I took my time finishing my coffee before finally stepping outside. "Good morning, Karen," I said, grinning. She pointed an accusatory finger at my mailbox. "That thing is an eyesore." I shrugged. "It's a mailbox." She glared at me. "It violates HOA standards." I tilted my head. "Does it?" "Because I checked and there's no rule about colors. It's perfectly legal." Her mouth twitched. I could tell she hadn't expected me to actually research the rules. He probably thought I would cave under the pressure. "This is harassment," she snapped. I raised an eyebrow. "Harassment? Karen, you called the cops on my kids for playing outside. Then you reported me to the HOA over imaginary noise violations. And now you're mad because I painted my own property?" Karen's lips thinned into a tight line. "You think you're funny." I smiled. "I know I am." For a moment she just stood there, nostrils flaring, and I knew she was trying to come up with a new attack plan. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and marched back to her house. I watched her go, knowing full well this wasn't over. And I was right. The next morning I received another HOA notice, this time claiming my grass was too long. I grabbed a tape measure and checked. My grass was well within the HOA guidelines. Karen was now just making things up. So, naturally, I started mowing my lawn at exactly 7 in the morning on weekends. Was it petty? Absolutely. But was it satisfying to see Karen peeking through her blinds, seething with rage? Even more so. But the real tipping point came when she escalated from petty complaints to full-blown sabotage. One afternoon, I caught her on my security camera sneaking onto my lawn and bending my garden hose in a way that would make it burst the next time I turned it on. She had actually stepped onto my property and tried to mess with my stuff. That was a line she shouldn't have crossed. I decided to return the favor, but in a way she never saw coming. I spent the next few days gathering support from the other neighbors. Turns out, Karen had a long history of terrorizing people with her complaints and HOA threats. I wasn't the only one tired of her antics. Some of my neighbors had their own horror stories, like the time she tried to get a family fined because their dog looked at her funny. So, together we planned the ultimate neighborhood prank. One evening, while Karen was out grocery shopping, we set up an entire kids' play festival on my front lawn. Balloons, a bounce house, music, the works. By the time she returned, there were over a dozen kids laughing and playing in the very space she had tried to control. Karen's reaction was priceless. She screeched to a stop in her driveway, stepping out of her car with a look of absolute horror. Her face turned beet red as she took in the scene. The children, the music, the parents chatting casually while their kids ran around in happy chaos. She stormed toward me, fists clenched. "This is an abomination," she shrieked. I took a sip of my lemonade and smiled. "What's wrong, Karen? The sound of kids playing too much for you." She pointed a shaking finger at me. "I'm reporting this to the HOA." I shrugged. "Go ahead. But we all checked the rules. There's no rule against neighborhood gatherings." The realization dawned on her slowly. She looked around and saw the smirking faces of the other neighbors. People who had once been silent, now standing against her. She wasn't just fighting me anymore. She had made enemies of the entire block. Karen turned on her heel and stormed back into her house, slamming the door so hard a nearby bird took off in fright. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the sweet, sweet taste of victory. But deep down I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat. And sure enough, a few days later she came up with her biggest, most ridiculous move yet. A move so insane, so over the top that even I wasn't prepared for it. She faked an injury. And that's when everything really went off the rails. I should have known Karen wouldn't accept defeat so easily. After the neighborhood completely turned against her, she went quiet for a few days. No complaints, no ridiculous HOA notices, no scowling from her front porch. It was almost peaceful. Almost. But I knew better. Karen was the type to retreat only when she was plotting something bigger. And sure enough, her next move was so insane, so utterly absurd, that even I couldn't believe she had actually done it. It started one afternoon when I was pulling into my driveway. I had just picked up some groceries when I saw Karen standing near the edge of my property, looking suspiciously at my front yard. She wasn't saying anything or making any dramatic gestures, just standing there with an odd expression, like she was planning something devious. I decided to ignore her and carried my bags inside. 5 minutes later, I heard the most ridiculous, exaggerated scream I had ever heard in my life. I rushed back outside just in time to see Karen lying on my driveway, clutching her knee like she had just been tackled by a professional linebacker. She was groaning in pain, twisting on the pavement as if she had been brutally injured. A few neighbors had come outside to see what was going on, and Karen, always one for an audience, wasted no time putting on a show. "Oh, my leg. My leg," she wailed, dramatically throwing her head back. I slipped on his dangerous property." I stared at her, completely dumbfounded. It hadn't rained in days. There were no obstacles, no puddles, no reason for anyone to slip on my driveway. She had literally just dropped herself on the ground like a terrible soap opera actress. A few neighbors exchanged glances, barely holding back their laughter. One of them, an elderly man named Mr. Thompson, muttered, "She's finally lost it." I crossed my arms and sighed. "Karen, what are you doing?" She turned her furious gaze on me as if I had personally pushed her onto the ground. "Your driveway is unsafe." I tripped. I could have broken a bone. "This is negligence and I will be pressing charges." I exhaled slowly, trying to hold back my irritation. "You tripped on nothing?" she gasped, as if I had just insulted her entire family lineage. "Are you calling me a liar? How dare you? You're responsible for this. You." Before she could finish, flashing red and blue lights appeared at the end of the street. I blinked. "You called the cops?" Again. Karen sat up dramatically, clutching her chest as if she were about to faint. "I had to. This is a serious injury. I could be permanently damaged." 2 officers stepped out of the patrol car, the same ones from before. They looked at Karen, then at me, then at the completely empty, hazard-free driveway. The male officer sighed. "You again." Karen immediately went into full victim mode. "Oh, thank goodness you're here. I was just walking when I suddenly slipped on his dangerous driveway. I'm in so much pain, I think I need medical attention." The female officer crouched down, her expression blank. "Ma'am, do you need an ambulance?" Karen's eyes flickered with hesitation. She knew an ambulance would mean a real medical examination, which would reveal that she wasn't injured at all. No," she said quickly. "But I definitely need to file a report. He's endangering residents with his lack of property maintenance." The officer gave me a tired look. "Sir, do you have security cameras?" I grinned. "Oh, absolutely." Karen's entire body stiffened. "That won't be necessary." The officer ignored her. "Can we see the footage?" I led them inside, pulling up the security camera feed. The entire neighborhood had followed us to my porch, watching the drama unfold. I played back the footage, and there it was. Karen standing perfectly still, glancing around to make sure no one was watching, then dramatically flinging herself onto my driveway like she was auditioning for a bad action movie. The room fell silent for a second. Then the female officer snorted. The male officer actually laughed, shaking his head. A few neighbors chuckled and someone muttered, "Unbelievable." Karen's face turned an unnatural shade of red. This is harassment. You're all ganging up on me." The officer straightened. "Ma'am, you just faked an injury and tried to accuse your neighbor of negligence. That's filing a false police report. We could fine you for this." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. For the first time in this ridiculous saga, she seemed genuinely nervous. But I was just... The male officer held up a hand. Ma'am, this needs to stop. We've been called here multiple times for non-issues. If you keep misusing emergency services, you could face serious legal consequences. Karen huffed, glaring at me like this was all my fault. Without another word, she got up, suddenly completely fine, and stormed back into her house, slamming the door behind her. The neighborhood erupted into laughter. I leaned against my doorframe, shaking my head. Well, that was fun. The female officer smirked. I don't think we'll be getting any more calls from her for a while. I wasn't so sure about that. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. She had been embarrassed in front of the entire neighborhood, caught on camera faking an injury and scolded by the police. That should have been the end of it. But I knew Karen. This was only going to make her double down. And sure enough, 2 days later I found out just how far she was willing to go. The HOA had scheduled an emergency meeting, with the sole agenda of discussing my pattern of harassment against Karen. That's when I realized, Karen wasn't done. Not by a long shot. She had one more trick up her sleeve. And this time she was aiming to get me kicked out of the neighborhood for good. The emergency HOA meeting was set for Saturday evening, and I knew exactly who was behind it. Karen had gone quiet since her dramatic, self-inflicted fall on my driveway, but that didn't mean she had given up. No, Karen was the kind of person who didn't accept reality unless it was shaped exactly the way she wanted it. Since she couldn't beat me through petty complaints, fake injuries, or even the police, she was now trying to use the HOA to officially make my life miserable. When I arrived at the community center, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The usual HOA meetings were about minor things like streetlight replacements and pool hours, but this one had a different energy. People were murmuring to each other, glancing at me and then at Karen, who sat near the front with her arms crossed, wearing the smug expression of someone who thought they had already won. The HOA president, Mr. Garcia, cleared his throat and tapped his pen against the table. All right, let's get this meeting started. We have an urgent matter brought forth by one of our residents. Karen shot up from her chair like she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. Yes. I would like to formally file a complaint against my neighbor Mike for ongoing harassment, disorderly conduct and destruction of community standards. I blinked. Destruction of community standards? Karen lifted her chin. Yes. Ever since he moved in, this neighborhood has been plagued by excessive noise, children running wild, a mailbox that is an absolute disgrace, and an ongoing campaign of aggression toward me. I no longer feel safe in my own home. A few people snickered, but she ignored them. Mr. Garcia sighed. Karen, we've had this conversation before. You have filed more complaints than every other resident combined. We cannot penalize someone simply because their children play outside. Karen gasped, putting a hand over her chest like she had just been personally betrayed. So you're just going to let him break all the rules? He mows his lawn at 7 in the morning. He deliberately painted his mailbox in an offensive color. He hosts loud, disruptive parties with screaming children. I raised a hand. It was one party. A completely legal gathering which half the neighborhood attended, including your own HOA board members. Karen's mouth twitched. She knew she couldn't argue against that one. One of the older residents, Mrs. Patel, cleared her throat. Karen dear, this is getting out of hand. We've all lived here for years and no one else seems to have any issues with Mike or his family. You, on the other hand, have called the police multiple times over nonsense. Karen's eye twitched. Because someone has to enforce the rules. Another neighbor, a dad named Greg, raised an eyebrow. Are you enforcing them or are you just making them up as you go? A murmur of agreement spread through the room. Karen's face turned a deep shade of red. Desperate, she turned back to Mr. Garcia. But he is a menace. He deliberately antagonizes me. Mr. Garcia rubbed his temples, clearly exhausted. Do you have any actual proof of harassment? Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. She floundered for a second before blurting out. He installed cameras to spy on me. The room fell silent. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. I installed security cameras after you faked a fall on my property, Karen. And those cameras also caught you sneaking onto my lawn and trying to sabotage my garden hose. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Karen stammered. I was just inspecting for violations. Greg snorted. Violations? In someone's backyard. Karen's panic was showing now. She was losing control of the situation and she knew it. She turned to the HOA board, pleading. You can't let him get away with this. If you don't stop him now, what's next? Loud barbecues every weekend? More garish decorations? Complete anarchy. Mr. Garcia sighed. Karen, we are officially dismissing this complaint due to lack of evidence and because, quite frankly, it sounds like you are the one harassing your neighbor, not the other way around. The room erupted in whispers. Karen's face twisted into pure fury. You're all against me, she spat. I see what this is. This is bullying. This is discrimination. Mr. Garcia leaned forward. Karen, I'm going to be completely honest with you. If you continue these antics, the board will have to consider disciplinary action against you. That was the final blow. Karen stood there, shaking, before abruptly grabbing her purse and storming out of the room. The door slammed behind her, leaving an awkward silence. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. After the meeting, a few neighbors patted me on the back, cracking jokes about Karen finally getting put in her place. But I wasn't so sure it was over. Karen wasn't the type to accept reality. And sure enough, 2 days later I woke up to something completely unexpected. A letter. Not an HOA complaint. Not a police warning. But a legal notice. Karen was suing me. The charge? Emotional distress. I stared at the paper, then burst out laughing. She was really going to take this all the way. That's when I knew I had to make sure this ended for good. If Karen wanted a war, I was going to finish it once and for all. When I first saw the legal notice, I thought it was a joke. Karen suing me for emotional distress? After everything she had done? The woman who had called the cops on my kids, sabotaged my property, faked an injury, and tried to get me kicked out of my own neighborhood was now playing the victim? It was almost impressive how far she was willing to go just to prove a point. Almost. I took the notice to my lawyer, a no-nonsense guy named Richard who had seen his fair share of ridiculous lawsuits. He read through the document with a straight face, flipping the pages slowly. When he finished, he set it down and looked at me. This is one of the dumbest cases I've ever seen. I laughed. So what do? We counter. Richard wasted no time. He drafted a response, making it clear that Karen's case had no merit. Not only had I done nothing wrong, but we also had hard evidence that she was the one harassing me. The security footage of her faking an injury? The countless false reports? The neighborhood-wide complaints about her behavior? It was all neatly compiled into a case against her. When Karen received our response, I expected some kind of reaction. Another tantrum, another police call, maybe even a new fake injury. But for the first time since this whole saga started, she went quiet. No angry rants, no HOA notices, nothing. I should have known that meant she was planning something worse. A week before our scheduled court date, I found out exactly what that was. Karen had decided to go all in. She stopped paying her HOA fees. At first it seemed like a desperate move. Maybe she thought if she ignored the HOA, they'd somehow take her side. But that wasn't how things worked. The HOA wasn't exactly my favorite organization, but they had rules. Rules that applied to everyone, even Karen. And one of those rules was simple. If you refused to pay your fees for too long, the HOA could take legal action. And in extreme cases, they could initiate foreclosure. Karen had pushed her luck too far for too long. I wasn't the only one laughing when the official HOA notice arrived at her door. A few neighbors saw it and spread the word. Soon the entire neighborhood was buzzing with the news. Karen had spent years trying to control everyone else, and now she was the one facing consequences. But Karen being Karen, she didn't accept defeat quietly. Instead of paying her overdue fees, she went on a full-scale meltdown. She started leaving nasty notes on people's doors, accusing the entire neighborhood of conspiring against her. She even tried to organize a protest against the HOA, claiming they were corrupt and violating her rights. But here's the thing. No one in the neighborhood actually liked Karen. She had spent too long alienating everyone. So when she tried to rally people to her cause, all she got were eye rolls and polite excuses. The final straw came when the foreclosure process officially started. Karen tried to fight it, but she had no case. The HOA had everything they needed to proceed, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. On the day she finally had to leave, the entire neighborhood gathered outside, pretending to be coincidentally out on their lawns, chatting, walking dogs, watering plants. Everyone wanted to see the grand exit. Karen stomped out of her house, her face twisted with rage, dragging a suitcase behind her. Movers loaded the last of her things into a truck while she muttered under her breath, throwing glares at anyone who dared to make eye contact. I stood on my porch, sipping my coffee, watching as she turned toward me one last time. "This is your fault," she hissed. I took a slow sip before answering. "No, Karen. This is yours." She clenched her fists like she wanted to say something else, but there was nothing left to say. She had lost. With one final glare, she climbed into her car and sped off down the street, never looking back. The moment she was gone, a loud cheer erupted through the neighborhood. Someone popped a bottle of champagne. A few people actually started clapping. The tension that had been hanging over the street for months had finally lifted. A few weeks later, a new family moved into Karen's old house. They had young kids, friendly smiles, and zero interest in controlling the lives of their neighbors. Life went back to normal. And just like that, Karen became nothing more than a ridiculous story, a legend of the neighborhood. A warning to anyone who thought they could rule over others through sheer pettiness. But the best part? A few months later, I got a message from an old coworker who had moved to a different town. He sent me a link to a local community forum. The title: "New Neighbor Keeps Calling the Cops on Kids for Playing Outside. What do we do?" And there, in the comments, was a familiar name. Karen had moved. And she was already at it again.